The story of King George III is often reduced to a simple label: the Mad King. That label has shaped public memory for generations, yet it hides a far more complex reality. His illness was not just a private tragedy, but a national crisis that unfolded in full view of politics, power, and public expectation. Understanding the madness of King George is essential because it sits at the crossroads of personal suffering and state authority. When a monarch's mind began to fail, the stability of the nation was forced into question. This topic matters because George III was not a weak or distant ruler before his illness. He reigned during one of the most turbulent periods in British history, marked by war, revolution, and the expansion of empire. His condition exposed how fragile even the most powerful institutions could be when they rested on a single human being. The king's episodes of mental disturbance challenged long-held beliefs about divine authority, duty, and the image of the monarch as a steady and moral guide for the nation. The madness of King George also reveals how societies understand and manage mental illness. In the 18th century, there was no clear boundary between medical care, moral judgment, and punishment. Treatments were harsh, theories were uncertain, and fear shaped decisions as much as science. The king's illness forced doctors, politicians, and family members to confront questions they were not prepared to answer. How do you treat a king who cannot govern himself? How do you protect the state without destroying the dignity of the crown? This subject offers a powerful human narrative. George III was a husband, a father, and a man deeply committed to his role. His moments of clarity and collapse create emotional contrast that helps modern people to connect with the past. The madness of King George was not an isolated medical mystery, but a defining force in British political life. His illness shaped debates over constitutional authority, accelerated changes in governance, and influenced how future generations viewed monarchy itself. Rather than weakening the state, the crisis helped clarify the limits of royal power and strengthen parliamentary control. The video that follows this story from historical context to personal consequence. We explore the world George III inherited, the nature of his illness, the reactions of those around him, and the lasting impact of his condition on Britain's political system and cultural memory. By examining these elements together, the madness of King George emerges not as a footnote, but as a central chapter in the history of modern Britain. To understand the crisis caused by King George III's illness, it is necessary to understand the political system he ruled. By the 18th century, Britain was no longer an absolute monarchy. Power was shared, contested, and limited by law, tradition, and parliament. The king remained the symbolic center of authority, but his actions were closely tied to ministers, elected officials, and established institutions. This balance made the monarch both powerful and vulnerable. The constitutional framework of Britain had been shaped by earlier conflicts, especially the Civil War of the 17th century and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. These events firmly established that a king could not rule without parliament. Laws, taxes, and military decisions required parliamentary approval. The monarch still appointed ministers and influenced policy, but legitimacy depended on cooperation rather than command. George III inherited a crown that carried responsibility without unchecked control. The role of the king was also deeply moral. The monarch was expected to embody stability, restraint, and virtue. Personal conduct mattered because it reflected the health of the nation itself. A king who appeared weak, immoral, or unstable risked undermining public trust. This expectation placed enormous pressure on George III, particularly during moments when his behavior no longer matched the image the public demanded. Politically, Britain was divided by factions rather than formal parties. Whigs and Tories competed for influence, but loyalty shifted often, driven by ambition as much as ideology. The king played an active role in managing these rivalries. George III believed strongly in choosing ministers he trusted, which brought him into conflict with political elites who feared royal overreach. His illness intensified these tensions, as uncertainty over his capacity raised fears of manipulation and power grabs. Britain's growing empire added another layer of strain. The king ruled territories across North America, the Caribbean, India, and beyond. Decisions made in London had global consequences. Wars were expensive, administration was complex, and rebellion was a constant threat. A stable monarch was seen as essential to maintaining order across this vast system. When George III became ill, Doubts about leadership extended far beyond Britain's shores. Public confidence in monarchy relied heavily on continuity. The idea that the crown could function smoothly from one generation to the next was central to national identity. Any disruption to this image risked reopening old fears of chaos and civil conflict. Memories of past instability were still present, and the prospect of an incapacitated king raised uncomfortable questions about succession and legitimacy. The legal system offered no clear solution for a mentally ill monarch. There were no established rules for declaring a king unfit to rule. Removing a reigning monarch was politically dangerous and symbolically disruptive. This uncertainty meant that George III's illness was not just a medical concern, but a constitutional emergency. Every decision carried the risk of setting a precedent that could reshape the monarchy forever. This political background explains why reactions to the king's condition were so cautious and often secretive. Officials feared panic, division, and loss of authority. The system depended on the assumption that the king was capable of fulfilling his role. Once that assumption was shaken, the entire structure of governance came under strain. Against this backdrop, the madness of King George becomes more than a personal tragedy. It reveals the fragile foundations of power in a constitutional monarchy and exposes how deeply political stability depended on the health of a single individual. Britain in the late 18th century was a society marked by sharp divisions, rapid change, and constant uncertainty. Daily life was shaped by class, tradition, and a strong sense of social order. Most people accepted hierarchy as natural, believing that stability depended on everyone knowing their place. The king stood at the top of this structure, not only as a political leader, but as a symbol of unity and moral guidance. Religion played a central role in shaping attitudes and behavior. The Church of England was closely tied to the state, and loyalty to crown and church were often treated as the same thing. Mental illness was commonly viewed through a moral or spiritual lens. Sudden changes in behavior could be seen as signs of divine punishment, personal weakness, or loss of self-control. These beliefs influenced how the public understood the king's condition and why it caused such anxiety. The growth of print culture meant that news traveled faster than ever before. Newspapers, pamphlets, and cartoons spread information, rumor, and satire throughout cities and towns. Political debate was no longer confined to parliament or elite circles. Ordinary citizens discussed royal behavior in coffeehouses and taverns. This expanding public sphere made secrecy difficult and increased pressure on officials to control the narrative surrounding the king's health. War was a constant presence in British life. Conflicts with France, colonial unrest, and the memory of the American Revolution shaped public mood. Military success was often linked to national pride and confidence in leadership. A king perceived as weak or unstable threatened that confidence. At a time when Britain needed unity and resolve, the idea of a monarch who could not govern himself was deeply unsettling. Economic conditions added further strain. Industrial growth was beginning to transform cities, while rural populations faced hardship and displacement. Inequality was visible and often resented. In such an environment, the monarchy served as a symbol of continuity amid disruption. Any sign that the crown itself was unstable risked feeding broader fears of social breakdown. Political loyalties were intense and often personal. Supporters and critics of the king interpreted events in ways that suited their interests. Some defended George III fiercely, emphasizing loyalty and compassion. Others used his illness to argue for limits on royal influence or to advance their own power. Public opinion was divided, emotional, and increasingly influential. Satire became a powerful tool during this period. Artists and writers mocked political figures and exposed private weaknesses to public view. The king was not exempt. Even whispers of madness became material for humor and criticism. While such portrayals entertained, they also shaped how people understood the crisis. Laughter coexisted with fear, making the king both a tragic figure and a subject of ridicule. This social environment meant that George III's illness unfolded under intense scrutiny. The expectations placed on him were high, and tolerance for visible weakness was low. The public wanted reassurance, strength, and order. Instead, they faced uncertainty and silence. This tension between appearance and reality defined the national mood during the king's episodes of illness. Understanding this broader social context helps explain why the madness of King George resonated so deeply. It touched on fears about authority, morality, and the future of the nation. George III was born in 1738 into a royal family shaped by duty, discipline, and a strong sense of moral responsibility. From an early age, he was prepared for kingship with a seriousness that set him apart from many of his predecessors. His education focused on history, religion, and the principles of constitutional monarchy. He was taught that a king's role was to serve the nation, not dominate it. This belief stayed with him throughout his life. Unlike earlier monarchs who embraced court excess, George III valued restraint and domestic order. He was deeply devoted to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and took pride in being a family man. At a time when royal mistresses were common, his commitment to marriage earned him respect from the public. This image of moral stability became central to how people viewed him and later intensified the shock when his behavior began to change. George III was hardworking and conscientious, sometimes to a fault. He involved himself closely in government affairs, reading reports, attending meetings, and corresponding extensively with ministers. While this diligence reflected dedication, it also placed enormous mental strain on him. The pressures of leadership, combined with his strong sense of personal responsibility, left little room for rest or emotional release. As a ruler, he was stubborn and deeply convinced of his own judgment. He believed the monarchy still had an important guiding role in government and resisted efforts to reduce royal influence. This brought him into conflict with political elites who favored greater parliamentary control. These struggles were not merely political but personal. George III viewed opposition as a challenge to his duty rather than a normal part of governance. Emotionally, he could be intense and private. He struggled to express vulnerability and was uncomfortable with displays of weakness. This emotional restraint shaped how those around him interpreted his early symptoms. Moments of agitation or erratic speech were sometimes dismissed as stress or temper rather than warning signs of deeper illness. Physically, George III was generally healthy in his early years, though he experienced recurring health problems that caused discomfort and fatigue. These issues, while common, may have contributed to his overall stress and exhaustion. Combined with long hours of work and limited understanding of mental health, they created conditions that left him vulnerable. Publicly, the king was seen as stable, principled, and reliable. He represented order in a changing world. This reputation mattered greatly when illness emerged. The contrast between the responsible monarch and the man who later lost control of his speech and behavior made the crisis more disturbing for those who witnessed it. Understanding George III before his illness is essential because it shows what was lost and why the nation reacted as it did. His madness did not define his entire life, but it reshaped how that life was remembered. Now we will explore how the first signs of illness appeared and how quickly private concern became a matter of state. The first signs that something was wrong with King George III did not appear suddenly or dramatically. They emerged gradually, through changes in behavior that were confusing and easy to misinterpret. At first, the king showed signs of restlessness, anxiety, and difficulty sleeping. He spoke rapidly, jumped between topics, and struggled to focus. These behaviors were troubling, but they did not immediately suggest a serious medical crisis. As time passed, the symptoms became harder to ignore. The king experienced episodes of extreme agitation, followed by exhaustion. His speech grew pressured and incoherent, sometimes continuing for hours without pause. He became overly emotional, shifting quickly from laughter to anger or despair. These changes alarmed those closest to him, particularly his family and senior ministers, who relied on his clarity to govern. Physical symptoms accompanied these behavioral changes. George III complained of severe pain, digestive problems, and weakness. His appearance deteriorated during episodes, and he sometimes seemed unable to recognize familiar people or surroundings. These physical and mental symptoms together deepened concern, as they suggested a condition beyond ordinary stress or illness. The reaction within the royal household was cautious and fearful. Admitting that the king was ill carried enormous consequences. Servants, doctors, and officials were under pressure to minimize what they observed. Reports were softened, and uncomfortable details were withheld. Protecting the image of the crown became as important as protecting the king himself. Early medical responses were limited and often harmful. Physicians relied on treatments common at the time, including bleeding, purging, and restrictive diets. These methods were based on theories about bodily balance rather than scientific evidence. Instead of relieving symptoms, they likely increased the king's suffering and prolonged his episodes. As the illness progressed, it became impossible to conceal. The king's inability to perform basic duties disrupted government business. Meetings were postponed, documents went unsigned, and decisions stalled. Ministers were forced to confront the reality that the nation's leader could not function reliably. The emotional toll of this period was immense. George III himself was aware that something was wrong. In moments of clarity, he expressed fear and shame over his condition. The loss of control over his own mind was deeply distressing for a man who valued discipline and duty above all else. The onset of illness marked a turning point. What began as private concern quickly became a national issue. The question was no longer whether the king was ill, but how long the illness would last, and whether the country could afford to wait. Now he explores how medicine of the time attempted to explain and treat madness, and why those efforts often failed. In the 18th century, mental illness was poorly understood and often feared. There was no clear medical distinction between physical disease, emotional distress, and moral failure. Madness was seen as a disruption of reason, which many believed defined what it meant to be human. When reason failed, society often responded with control rather than care. Medical theory at the time was rooted in ideas about balance within the body. Health was believed to depend on the proper flow of fluids and forces. When these became unbalanced, illness followed. Mental disturbance was often explained as a disorder of the nerves or an excess of bodily energy. Treatments aimed to restore order through physical intervention, not psychological support. Physicians relied on methods such as bloodletting, blistering, and purging. These practices were painful and exhausting, especially for someone already weakened by illness. Restraint was also common, justified as necessary to prevent harm. For the king, these methods were applied with the same logic used on ordinary patients, despite the unique emotional and political pressures he faced. Doctors disagreed sharply over diagnosis and treatment. Some believed the king suffered from temporary nervous excitement brought on by stress. Others suspected a deeper and more dangerous condition. Without shared standards or reliable evidence, medical opinions shifted constantly. This uncertainty undermined confidence and fueled political anxiety. The role of royal physicians was especially difficult. They were responsible not only for the king's health, but for reassuring ministers and the public. Admitting ignorance or failure was risky. Optimistic reports were sometimes issued even when the king's condition had not improved. Hope became a strategy as much as a belief. From a modern perspective, the treatments applied to George III appear cruel and ineffective. Yet they reflected the limits of contemporary knowledge rather than deliberate neglect. Medicine had not yet developed the tools needed to understand mental illness as a complex interaction of mind and body. The king's suffering highlighted the gap between medical ambition and reality. Despite constant attention and care, doctors could not control the course of his illness. This failure forced the political system to confront the fact that science could not provide certainty or protection. The medical response to George III shaped how madness was perceived at every level of society. It reinforced fear, justified restraint, and delayed more humane approaches. Now we discuss how the court and the public reacted as the king's condition became impossible to ignore. As King George III's illness became more visible, reactions within the royal court were marked by fear, confusion, and careful calculation. Courtiers understood that every word spoken and every action taken around the king could have political consequences. Loyalty to the monarch clashed with concern for the stability of the state. Many chose silence, hoping the illness would pass quickly and spare them difficult decisions. Secrecy became a central strategy. Access to the king was restricted, reports were filtered, and official statements were vague. Those closest to George III attempted to manage appearances, presenting moments of calm as signs of recovery while downplaying episodes of distress. This effort to control information reflected deep anxiety about how the public and political rivals might respond. Within the royal family, emotions ran high. Queen Charlotte faced the impossible task of protecting her husband while also safeguarding the future of the monarchy. She endured public scrutiny and private grief, often excluded from medical decisions and political discussions. The king's children, particularly the Prince of Wales, reacted with a mix of concern, frustration, and ambition. Their relationships were strained by uncertainty and mistrust. Among politicians, the king's condition intensified existing divisions. Supporters of the government feared that acknowledging incapacity would weaken their position. Opponents saw opportunity in crisis, arguing that the nation could not be led by a ruler who lacked control over his own mind. Rumors circulated freely, feeding suspicion and rivalry. The public response was complex and emotional. Many people felt genuine sympathy for the king, viewing his suffering as tragic and undeserved. Others reacted with fear, questioning whether divine favor had been withdrawn from the crown. Satirical prints and commentary spread rapidly, blending humor with criticism. Madness became a public spectacle, even as officials tried to suppress it. Newspapers played a powerful role in shaping perception. While some publications defended the king and urged patience, others hinted at darker truths. The lack of clear information encouraged speculation. Every delay in government business, every unusual report from court, reinforced the sense that something was deeply wrong. This atmosphere of uncertainty eroded confidence. The image of the monarch as a stable, guiding presence was damaged. Trust in leadership weakened, and pressure mounted for a solution. The court could no longer contain the crisis. The question of who should rule, and under what authority, could no longer be avoided. The illness of King George III created a constitutional problem that Britain had never fully faced before. There was no clear legal process for dealing with a reigning monarch who was alive but unable to govern. The system relied on the assumption that the king was capable of fulfilling his duties. Once that assumption collapsed, Parliament was forced to act without precedent. At the center of the crisis was the question of regency. If the king could not rule, who should govern in his place, and under what limits? The most obvious candidate was the Prince of Wales, the king's eldest son. However, granting him full royal authority raised serious concerns. Political factions feared that a regency could shift the balance of power permanently and reward one side over the other. Debates in Parliament were intense and often bitter. Supporters of the government argued for a limited regency, designed to preserve the king's authority and allow for his possible recovery. Opponents pushed for broader powers for the Prince of Wales, seeing an opportunity to reshape leadership. These arguments were not only legal but deeply personal, shaped by distrust, ambition, and fear of instability. The king's absence from decision-making exposed how dependent governance was on royal consent. Bills stalled, appointments were delayed, and uncertainty slowed the machinery of state. Every delay increased pressure on Parliament to resolve the crisis quickly, even as members disagreed on how to proceed. Public attention focused sharply on these debates. Newspapers reported daily developments, and ordinary citizens followed the crisis closely. The idea that Parliament might effectively rule without the king unsettled traditional beliefs about authority. At the same time, many accepted that necessity required action. The crisis forced the nation to confront the limits of monarchy in practical terms. The situation was further complicated by moments of apparent recovery. Just as Parliament moved toward establishing a regency, the king showed signs of improvement. This sudden change halted proceedings and reinforced the belief that patience might restore normal order. Recovery delayed reform and preserved the illusion that the monarchy could return to stability without structural change. Although a full regency was avoided during this phase, the crisis left lasting marks. It clarified Parliament's authority to act in emergencies and weakened the idea of the king as an untouchable figure. The balance of power shifted subtly but permanently toward elected government. The Regency Crisis revealed that the strength of the British system lay in its flexibility. It could adapt without revolution, even under extreme pressure. Yet it also showed the personal cost of such adaptation. The political struggle unfolded alongside private suffering, especially within the royal household. King George III's illness took a profound toll on his family, disrupting relationships and reshaping daily life at court. The Queen, Charlotte, found herself in a position of both caretaker and protector. She balanced her concern for her husband's welfare with the need to preserve the dignity of the monarchy. Managing the household became a constant challenge, as she had to monitor the king's behavior while maintaining appearances for visitors and officials. The king's children were affected deeply. The uncertainty of their father's condition caused emotional strain, and they often struggled to understand what was happening. Older children felt a sense of responsibility, while younger ones were frightened by unpredictable outbursts. Family routines were disrupted, with moments of joy interrupted by sudden episodes of agitation. The palace, usually a symbol of order, became a place of anxiety. George III himself was acutely aware of the impact of his illness on his family. He experienced guilt and frustration, recognizing that his inability to control his mind imposed emotional burdens on those closest to him. The contrast between his public role and private struggle intensified feelings of isolation. Despite periods of clarity, he often felt trapped within a mind that refused to obey his commands. Marriage, once a source of strength, became a site of tension. Queen Charlotte had to navigate moments of fear and resentment while continuing to provide care. Their partnership, while resilient, was tested by long periods of separation during treatment and restraint. Intimate communication was limited by the king's unpredictable mood swings and the need to protect him from distressing news. The emotional weight of the situation extended to the broader court. Courtiers were unsure how to interact with the king, balancing duty, fear, and personal loyalty. Staff faced constant stress, as minor mistakes could provoke intense reactions. Social life, once a forum for influence and networking, became constrained by the king's condition. This personal suffering was inseparable from public responsibility. George III's family had to contend with both private grief and the knowledge that their actions were scrutinized by politicians and the public alike. Every decision carried the dual weight of familial and national consequence. In these circumstances, the human cost of the king's madness was visible and immediate. The illness reshaped domestic life, eroded emotional stability, and forced the royal family into roles for which they were unprepared. Understanding this aspect of the crisis is essential because it highlights how political and medical issues intertwined with the personal and emotional. As King George III's illness progressed, medical and practical interventions became more intensive. Physical restraint was used to prevent harm, reflecting contemporary beliefs that extreme agitation required firm control. These methods, while often harsh, were considered necessary to maintain safety for both the king and those around him. Chains, straps, and close supervision were employed during severe episodes, highlighting the tension between care and control. Doctors experimented with various treatments, drawing on the medical knowledge of the time. Bloodletting, purging, and restrictive diets were common, based on the idea of restoring balance to the body. Herbal remedies, baths, and massage were also used in attempts to calm agitation. Some interventions were guided by observation and intuition rather than evidence, leading to mixed results and sometimes exacerbating suffering. The role of Dr. Francis Willis was particularly notable. Willis combined physical care with moral and psychological approaches. He sought to restore the king's routine, provide gentle encouragement, and establish trust. His methods emphasized consistent supervision, structured daily activity, and kindness alongside restraint. While still rooted in 18th-century medical theory, Willis's approach recognized the importance of mental engagement and human interaction. Recovery was often partial and temporary. The king would have periods of clarity, during which he could resume public duties and interact normally with family and ministers. These moments were celebrated and publicized, providing reassurance that the monarchy remained stable. Yet they were frequently followed by relapses, reminding observers that the illness was unpredictable and ongoing. The interventions raised ethical questions that resonate even today. To what extent could coercion be justified for the benefit of the patient and the state? How should dignity be preserved when public safety and national stability were at stake? These questions were never fully resolved at the time, leaving a legacy of debate about the treatment of mental illness in positions of power. Family and courtiers were deeply involved in the recovery process. Queen Charlotte, children, and loyal courtiers provided emotional support and monitored behavior, often under great personal stress. Their vigilance contributed to periods of calm, showing that human attention and care were as critical as medical intervention. The king's periods of recovery allowed Parliament and the court to maintain governance, albeit cautiously. Officials hoped for a return to normal order, yet remained aware that relapse could strike at any time. This combination of hope and uncertainty defined the experience of those closest to the king. Understanding treatment and recovery illustrates the interplay of medicine, authority, and human compassion. It highlights the complexity of managing illness in a context where public and private concerns were inseparable. In the years following his initial episodes, King George III experienced recurrent bouts of illness that grew longer and more severe. The intervals of clarity became shorter, and the intensity of agitation, confusion, and physical discomfort increased. These relapses made it clear that his condition was chronic, and that governance could not rely solely on his presence or judgment. Each episode brought renewed anxiety to the royal family and court. Queen Charlotte continued to provide care, managing her own fear and exhaustion while overseeing the king's surroundings. Children matured quickly in response to necessity, often assuming responsibilities beyond their years. Courtiers and physicians maintained vigilance, aware that the stakes were as much political as personal. The king's physical health also began to decline. Weakness, fatigue, and recurring pain became prominent features of his life. Loss of vision in later years compounded the difficulties, isolating him further and increasing dependency on others. Daily life was dominated by routines of supervision, treatment, and careful monitoring to prevent injury or escalation. As the illness recurred, George III withdrew increasingly from public life. He ceased attending meetings and public events, and correspondence with ministers became limited or heavily mediated. The machinery of government had to adjust, with deputies and trusted officials assuming responsibility for decisions. This shift demonstrated the flexibility of Britain's political system, but also underscored the human cost of relying on a single individual for leadership. Public perception evolved in response to the king's long-term incapacity. Early fear and speculation gave way to sympathy and respect for the suffering endured. While madness had once been a source of scandal, it increasingly became a narrative of endurance. The monarch was seen as a symbol of resilience, even as he could no longer govern effectively. Medical care adapted to chronic illness. The focus shifted from cure to management, balancing restraint, comfort, and engagement. Dr. Willis and subsequent physicians emphasized stability and routine, understanding that the king's well-being depended on minimizing stress and maintaining calm. These later years of illness demonstrated the interaction between human frailty and political necessity. The state adapted to the king's limitations without collapsing, yet the personal cost remained high. Family members, officials, and physicians shared the burden of care, and public attention remained intense. The decline of George III highlights the limits of personal power, even for a monarch, and the ability of institutions to endure despite human vulnerability. Now we will examine the symbolic role of the king, showing how public perception and national identity were shaped by his condition and the way it was managed over time. King George III's illness transformed him from a political leader into a symbol with multiple meanings. His struggles were observed by the public, commented on in the press, and debated in political circles. Over time, the king became emblematic of endurance, human vulnerability, and the complex relationship between authority and the individual. Madness challenged traditional notions of divine kingship. For centuries, monarchs were seen as appointed by God, embodying stability and moral guidance. George III's condition forced the public to reconcile the idea of a divinely sanctioned ruler with the reality of human frailty. Sympathy for the king grew alongside uncertainty, creating a nuanced image that combined reverence and concern. Public opinion shifted in response to both illness and perception. Initially, fear and ridicule were common, reflecting anxiety over leadership and stability. Satirical prints exaggerated episodes of madness, portraying the king in ways that provoked humor, but also conveyed serious unease about governance. Over time, as the severity and chronic nature of his condition became apparent, respect and compassion replaced ridicule for many observers. The monarchy itself benefited from this transformation. By humanizing the king, the nation could connect with him emotionally while preserving the legitimacy of the crown. The narrative of endurance reinforced loyalty and national identity. George III came to represent continuity despite personal limitation, showing that the crown could withstand crisis without collapsing. Symbolism also extended to political debates. The king's incapacity was used to illustrate the balance of power between monarchy and parliament. His condition demonstrated that government depended not solely on personal authority, but on institutional structures capable of adaptation. In this sense, the king became a living example of the strengths and limitations of constitutional monarchy. Cultural representations reinforced this symbolic role. Writers, artists, and commentators reflected on the king's suffering and resilience. His image served as both cautionary tale and source of admiration. The public absorbed these representations, shaping collective memory and influencing the way future generations interpreted his reign. Ultimately, George III as symbol represents the intersection of human vulnerability, political necessity, and cultural meaning. His illness elevated him beyond a private figure to a public icon whose experience illuminated both personal and national challenges. This symbolic legacy persisted long after his death, influencing history, literature, and perceptions of monarchy. Now we will explore the debates among historians and medical scholars over the diagnosis and causes of his condition, examining how interpretations have changed over time. The cause of King George III's madness has been the subject of debate for centuries. Historians and medical scholars have analyzed letters, diaries, and medical reports to understand the nature of his illness. Various theories have emerged, each reflecting the scientific knowledge and cultural assumptions of its time. One prominent theory is that the king suffered from porphyria, a genetic disorder that affects the nervous system and can cause episodes of mental disturbance, abdominal pain, and physical weakness. Proponents cite descriptions of his symptoms, including abdominal crises, agitation, and cyclical patterns of illness. Porphyria fits some aspects of his experience, though evidence is largely retrospective and relies on incomplete records. Other theories suggest bipolar disorder, based on patterns of mania and depression observed during episodes of illness. This diagnosis emphasizes behavioral and emotional aspects, including irritability, excessive energy, and periods of withdrawal. Modern psychiatry provides tools to understand mood disorders, but historical records are limited, making definitive conclusions difficult. Some scholars argue that stress, overwork, and environmental factors played a central role. The demands of kingship, combined with political conflict, personal responsibility, and social expectation, could have triggered or worsened episodes. This interpretation highlights the interaction of psychological and situational factors, rather than a single medical cause. The retrospective nature of diagnosis presents challenges. Physicians and historians must rely on written descriptions, which are often biased or incomplete. Observers interpreted symptoms according to contemporary norms and expectations, which may differ significantly from modern understanding. This creates uncertainty and requires caution when drawing conclusions. Despite disagreement, the debates themselves illuminate the complexity of George III's condition. They reveal how illness intersects with history, politics, and culture. Scholars explore not only medical causes, but also the impact on governance, family life, and national identity. Each theory provides a lens for understanding the broader consequences of his madness. The diversity of interpretation also reflects changing approaches to mental health over time. What was once seen as moral weakness is now examined through the lens of biology, psychology, and social context. These evolving perspectives show that understanding George III requires both historical and medical insight, and that his story remains relevant to discussions of mental illness and leadership. The story of King George III has inspired generations of writers, artists, and filmmakers. Literature has explored both the tragedy and the drama of his illness, portraying him as a human figure caught between duty and vulnerability. Biographies emphasize his dedication to family and country, while novels and plays dramatize the emotional and political stakes of his madness. In theater and film, the king has often been depicted at moments of crisis, highlighting both fear and compassion. Portrayals focus on the intensity of his episodes, the responses of those around him, and the tension between public duty and private suffering. These dramatizations provide audiences with a sense of immediacy, allowing them to experience the uncertainty, tension, and human emotion of the period. Shifts in interpretation reflect broader cultural trends. Earlier portrayals emphasized humor, ridicule, or moral lesson, while more recent adaptations focus on empathy, psychological depth, and historical accuracy. The king is now seen not only as a figure of history, but also as a lens through which to explore universal themes of vulnerability, resilience, and the pressures of leadership. Public fascination with George III's madness persists because it connects personal human experience to national history. The narrative bridges political events and individual life, demonstrating how one person's condition could influence a nation's course. It also invites reflection on contemporary issues, such as mental health, the treatment of illness, and the balance between personal struggle and public responsibility. Visual media, including film and television, have amplified his story. They offer a combination of narrative storytelling, historical detail, and emotional resonance. Audiences are invited to witness the intimate experiences of the king, his family, and the court, creating an emotional connection that written accounts alone may not achieve. The enduring interest in George III shows that history is not only about events, but about how people understand, interpret, and remember them. Cultural representations shape collective memory, influence education, and provide opportunities for reflection on power, vulnerability, and compassion. His story continues to resonate because it humanizes history, offering insight into the challenges of leadership and the enduring complexities of the human mind. The story of King George III demonstrates how personal vulnerability can intersect with political power and national stability. His illness, while deeply private, had public consequences that affected governance, family life, and society at large. By examining his experiences, we gain insight into the human costs of leadership and the resilience of institutions under pressure. Throughout his life, George III combined dedication, moral rigor, and a deep sense of duty. These qualities shaped both his successes and the challenges he faced when illness intervened. His periods of clarity, leadership, and familial devotion contrast sharply with episodes of madness, highlighting the tension between human limitation and societal expectation. The historical context surrounding his reign emphasizes the delicate balance of power in a constitutional monarchy. Political, social, and cultural forces all interacted with his condition, revealing how leadership depends on both individual capability and institutional structures. The responses of Parliament, the court, and the public demonstrate the adaptability of British governance while illustrating the anxiety generated by uncertainty at the highest level. Medical and scholarly analysis of George III's condition provides valuable lessons on the intersection of health, perception, and policy. Debates over diagnosis, treatment, and causation reflect evolving knowledge and cultural attitudes toward mental illness. They also show that understanding history requires consideration of both human experience and contemporary interpretation. The cultural legacy of George III highlights the power of narrative. His life and illness have been interpreted, dramatized, and remembered in ways that humanize history and connect audiences to the emotional realities of leadership and suffering. The king's story endures because it resonates with fundamental questions about responsibility, resilience, and empathy. The madness of King George III offers a complex and compelling lens through which to examine the interplay of personal struggle, political authority, and cultural memory. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by events, but by the individuals who experience them, and by the societies that interpret their lives. By understanding his story, we gain insight into the enduring challenges of leadership and the profound humanity that lies behind the facade of power.